Before I tell you about the man who wanted to disagree, I need to tell you about the woman who refused to let him. She left everything she had ever known, every city, every familiar face, every place that had ever called her by name, and walked 18 miles through a Wyoming blizzard on Christmas Eve. Not because she was brave, not because she was fearless, but because she had run out of every other option and forward was the only direction left. Her name was Eleanor Shaw, and by the time she knocked on Caleb Hartman's door, she had already survived more than most men twice her age. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far Eleanor's story travels tonight. Now let me take you back. A woman who walked 18 miles through a blizzard to save a man who had already given up. The wind came down off the mountains like something that had been waiting all year for this one night. It screamed through the passes, gathered itself across the open plain, and hit the Hartman Ranch with the full weight of everything winter had saved up. Snow fell sideways. The temperature had dropped so fast and so far that the creek had frozen solid in a single afternoon, and the few pines left standing near the barn looked like pale ghosts in the darkness, their branches bent nearly to the ground under the weight of what the sky kept throwing down. Inside the cabin, Caleb Hartman had not moved from his chair in 4 hours. He was 42 years old and looked 60. His hands, large scarred hands that had built fences and pulled calves and patched 100 leaking roofs, rested on his knees like tools he no longer needed. His beard had gone untrimmed for 2 months. His boots sat beside the door where he had left them 3 days ago when he had last gone outside to check the cattle. He had not bothered to put them back on. The fire was dying. There was wood stacked outside, not much but some, and he knew it was there. He had chosen not to get it. That choice, small and quiet and terrible, was the truest measure of where Caleb Hartman had arrived. 3 years since Margaret. 5 years since the ranch had been anything other than a slow disaster. The bank's letters sat unopened on the table beside a tin cup he had not washed in a week and a Bible he had not opened in longer than that. Outside, he could hear the cattle in the barn, what was left of them, making the low, exhausted sounds of animals that were trying to hold on to life and losing the argument. He had lost 15 head in the past month. The rest would not survive the winter. He knew that the way he knew his own name. He had accepted it. He had accepted all of it. 3 months ago, in a moment, he could barely remember a long afternoon in town with a bottle of whiskey and the kind of loneliness that makes a man do things he would never do sober. He had written a letter to a mail-order bride agency. He remembered very little of what he had written. He remembered being honest in a way that drunk men sometimes are, brutally and completely without the protective shields that sober men keep carefully in place. He had described the ranch truthfully. He had described himself truthfully. He had sealed the letter, mailed it, and forgotten about it the way a man forgets about prayers he no longer believes in. Nothing had come. Of course, nothing had come. He was not surprised. He was not anything. The fire reduced itself to a faint orange glow, and Caleb sat in the growing cold, and outside the storm screamed, and inside the only sound was the slow tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, and the irregular drip of water through the leaking roof into the pot Margaret had placed there 3 years ago to catch it. He had never fixed that leak. He had never fixed anything after Margaret. That was the truth of it, the whole ugly truth. He had stopped fixing things because somewhere deep inside the part of him that had once been capable of hope, he had made a decision without quite deciding it. He had decided to let everything fall apart, to let the cattle die and the roof leak and the bank take what it wanted because there was no one left to build it for. Margaret was buried on the rise behind the house under a pine tree she had loved. He could not see it from the window in this weather. He could never see it in the dark. He sat with his empty hands and listened to the storm and waited for nothing in particular. That was when the knock came. 3 sharp impacts against the door. Hard, deliberate, not the sound of a branch or a shutter in the wind, but the unmistakable sound of a human fist demanding entrance. Caleb did not move for a long moment. The knock came again. Harder this time. He stood slowly, joints protesting after hours in the cold chair, and reached above the door for the rifle. Not from any particular sense of threat, simply because out here you answered the door armed or you did not answer it at all. He pulled the door open 6 inches, and the wind came through the gap like it owned the place. The woman on his porch should not have been alive. She was covered in snow, so much of it packed so completely into every fold of her coat and every crease of her scarf that for a moment he thought the storm had sculpted something and set it on his doorstep as a joke. Her coat was dark wool, too thin by half for weather like this, and crusted white from collar to hem. Her bonnet had shifted sideways in the wind, revealing dark hair plastered flat against her head with ice. Her lips were the color of a winter sky before dawn, pale blue, barely moving. Her face was so drained of color it was nearly translucent. But her eyes were clear, sharp, entirely undefeated. Caleb Hartman. Her voice came out with surprising force for a woman who appeared to be half frozen solid. Not a question, a statement. She knew his name. She had come here specifically for him. He stared at her. His mind was working slowly, 4 hours of cold, and stillness had dulled the edges of everything, and he found himself struggling to process the simple fact of her existence on his porch. "Who are you?" he managed. "Eleanor Shaw." She shifted her weight, and he saw the small trunk at her feet, nearly buried in snow. "Your bride." The words arrived in a sequence that made no immediate sense. He heard them individually and could not arrange them into meaning. "Your bride." Then, like a door blown open by the wind, he remembered. The letter, the agency, the long, drunk afternoon, and the brutal honesty of a man writing to no one in particular, because the silence had become unbearable. "I wrote back," Eleanor said, and he heard the faint rattle of her teeth despite her effort to keep her voice steady. "You never responded." I took that as silent acceptance. "I've been traveling for 3 weeks. The train reached Cheyenne. I hired a wagon to Casper. The driver refused to go further in this weather." She paused. Caleb saw her grip the doorframe with one hand, a small, involuntary motion. "I walked the last 18 miles. He looked at her, then past her at the wall of white behind her, at the world erased by snow and darkness and cold that could kill a man in an hour. "You walked 18 miles. In this." "I had no other choice." She met his eyes without flinching. "Are you going to let me in, Mr. Hartman? Or are we both going to freeze while you process the situation?" Every instinct he had, the ones built from 3 years of being alone, 3 years of building walls so high and thick that nothing could get through them, not grief, not hope, not help of any kind, told him to step back and close the door. To tell her this was a mistake, that she needed to turn around and find her way back to civilization and leave him to the dying he had already started. Then the wind gusted hard enough to make the cabin walls flex, and Eleanor Shaw swayed on her feet, and Caleb saw her hand tighten on the doorframe, with the white-knuckled grip of someone using sheer will to stay upright. He stepped back and opened the door. She walked past him into the cabin, like she had been waiting to do exactly this her entire life. She moved with an economy of motion that he would come to recognize over the following weeks as simply the way Eleanor operated: no wasted movement, no unnecessary gestures, every action purposeful and connected to the next. She set her trunk down by the door with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what was inside it and had decided to preserve it. She unwound her frozen scarf from around her neck, ice cracking off it as she moved, and hung it on the peg by the door. She walked directly to the dying fireplace without being told where it was. She stood there for a moment, hands extended, absorbing whatever heat remained. Then she turned and looked at the room. Caleb braced himself for what came next. The recoil, the reassessment, the moment when a woman from Pennsylvania looked at the leaking roof and the dust-covered table and the sagging, abandoned wreck of a cabin and understood what she had actually walked 18 miles through a blizzard to reach. Eleanor Shaw looked at the room for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "You're nearly out of wood." "I know. Where's the rest of it?" "There isn't much. Outside under. We'll need to make it last." She was already moving to the cupboard, opening it, cataloging its contents with a swift, sweeping gaze. "You have flour, salt, some dried meat, beans." She looked at him over her shoulder. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" He did not answer. "That long," Eleanor said, and turned back to the cupboard. "Sit down, Mr. Hartman. You look like you're about to fall over." "This is my house." "Yes, and I'm your guest, and you look terrible, so sit down." There was no heat in her voice, no sharpness or condescension. It was simply the voice of a woman who had assessed the situation, determined what needed to happen, and was proceeding accordingly. "I'm going to cook something, then we're going to talk." He sat down. He was not entirely sure why. He had not taken direction from anyone in 3 years. He had built his solitude brick by brick and maintained it with the stubborn dedication of a man who had decided that allowing anyone in would only create new opportunities for loss. But Eleanor Shaw moved through his kitchen with a calm, steady competence that made arguing feel not just pointless, but somehow beside the point, as though the relevant decisions had already been made, and his participation in making them was a courtesy being extended, not a requirement. She found the pot, the pan, the wooden spoon. She measured by sight and mixed by instinct. Within 10 minutes after arriving on his doorstep, half frozen and barely standing, she had water-boiling beans soaking and a rough biscuit dough coming together between her hands. "You never responded to my letters," she said, not looking up. "I didn't get them. The postal service is that unreliable out here." He was quiet for a moment. "I stopped checking the mail." Her hands paused for just a fraction of a second, then resumed. "I see." The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was simply the silence of two strangers who had been thrown together by coincidence and desperation and had not yet determined what to make of each other. The smell of cooking filled the cabin, something Caleb had not experienced in so long that it hit him with an almost physical force. The smell of care, of someone doing something deliberately for his benefit, of warmth being made rather than simply present. He found his throat unexpectedly tight. "Why did you come?" he asked. "Really, a woman like you? What kind of woman is that?" She shaped the dough into rough biscuits with practiced efficiency. Educated, capable. You could have found better prospects than a failing ranch. "I was a teacher," Eleanor said, her voice carefully neutral, "in Pennsylvania, for 3 years, until the school board decided they preferred a man for the position. I was a seamstress after that until the woman I worked for accused me of stealing, which I did not do. I tried working in a shop. The owner's son thought I came with the position." She placed the biscuits in the pan. "I'm 28 years old, Mr. Hartman. I have no family. I have $12 to my name and a trunk with everything I own in it." She turned to look at him, then directly with those clear and undefeated eyes. "When I saw your advertisement, I didn't see it as settling. I saw it as surviving." Caleb looked at her, really looked for the first time past the exhaustion and the cold and the practical efficiency of her movements. He saw someone who had been worked over by the world quietly, systematically, without the courtesy of a fair fight, and hadn't stopped standing. He recognized it. He had seen that particular kind of damage in the mirror every morning. "I'm in debt," he said. "The cattle are dying. The bank is going to take this land in March if I can't make payment. I'm not," he stopped searching for the honest word, "I'm not what I was." "I know," Eleanor said simply. "You said as much in your letter." She handed him a plate, beans and biscuits, plain and simple and warm. "That's more honesty than I've had from anyone in 5 years." They ate in silence. The food was exactly what it was, simple, imperfect enough. Caleb ate with the dazed awareness of a man who had forgotten hunger was something that could be addressed rather than simply endured. "The cattle," Eleanor said when she had finished. "What are the symptoms?" He stared at her. "Why?" "Because I'm here and they're part of what's here, so symptoms." He told her lethargy, weight loss, discharge from eyes and nose. Two had developed a persistent cough. He had tried everything different, feed fresh pasture, keeping them warm. Nothing had made a difference. Eleanor set down her fork. Her eyes went distant in a way he would come to associate with her, working through a problem, a quality of interior focus that made her face very still, and her gaze turn inward. "The water," she said. "Where do they drink?" "The creek, same as always." "Has anything changed upstream in the last year? New construction, any mining?" Caleb frowned. "There's been a copper mining operation, about 5 miles up. Started last spring, I think." Eleanor stood up. The movement was so sudden and decisive that Caleb leaned back slightly. She walked to the window, wiped away the frost with her palm, and stared out into the blinding white of the storm, as though she could see straight through it to the creek and the water running beneath the ice, and the mine 5 miles away that he had barely thought about. "That's it," she said. "That's what's killing them." "What is copper poisoning?" She turned. I've seen it before. I traveled with a healer doctor, Morrison, for 2 years after I left teaching. We saw a case like this in Montana, a ranch near a mining operation. The copper leaches into the water from the mining runoff. The animals drink it every day, not enough to kill them quickly, but enough to accumulate. It attacks the liver, the blood. It looks like a dozen different diseases, because by the time you notice it, it's been going on for months. She met his eyes. The cattle that kept drinking the contaminated water in Montana all died. The rancher who listened to Dr. Morrison, who moved his herd to clean water and started a treatment of molasses and iron supplements, his herd recovered. Most of them. Caleb stared at her. She had been in his house for less than an hour. She was still visibly cold, still exhausted from 3 weeks of travel and 18 miles on foot through a blizzard. And she had just diagnosed a problem he had been unable to identify for months. "You think they can be saved?" he said slowly. "I think it's possible." She held his gaze without blinking. "I can't promise you anything, Mr. Hartman. I'm not a doctor, but I know what Dr. Morrison did, and I know what worked. If we act quickly, if we move them to clean water and start the treatment, there is a chance. The nearest clean source is the spring on the north side of the property. That's 3 miles from the barn. Then we move them tomorrow. In this," he gestured at the window at the howling white world beyond it. "The storm will break by morning," Eleanor said, with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent enough time outdoors to understand weather the way other people understood clocks. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to tell her that hope was a cruelty he had stopped allowing in himself, that tomorrow would look exactly like today, that the cattle were past saving the same way everything else was past saving. He had been telling himself these things for 3 years and had gotten very good at it. Instead, he looked at this woman who had walked 18 miles through a Wyoming blizzard and had not once, not for a single moment, since he had opened the door, suggested that any of this was impossible. "All right," he said quietly. "Tomorrow." That night, they slept on opposite sides of the sagging bed, with 2 blankets layered between them. Fully dressed, the fire banked down to preserve what little wood remained. It was Eleanor's idea, presented with the same calm practicality she brought to everything. "It's below freezing. We'll be warmer together. No one is here to witness." She said it as a matter of physics, not intimacy, and he had no reasonable argument against the logic of it. He lay awake for a long time in the dark, hyper-aware of the stranger beside him, listening to the storm outside and to the sound of another person breathing. 2 feet away, real and solid and present. He had forgotten what it was like to not be alone in a room, to have the darkness populated by someone else's existence. "Eleanor," he said quietly into the dark. Thank you for the food." A silence, then, "You're welcome." Another silence. "Mr. Hartman," she said. "Caleb. Caleb." He could hear the faint suggestion of something in her voice, not quite a smile, but close. "Try to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be difficult." He closed his eyes. The storm raged outside the thin walls of the cabin. The fire ticked and settled, and in the space where silence had lived for 3 years, there was now the quiet, steady sound of Eleanor Shaw, breathing, already asleep, already preparing for the morning. For the first time since Margaret died, Caleb Hartman fell asleep without feeling like the last person on earth. The world, when he opened his eyes, had been remade. Sunlight, genuine, generous, almost aggressive sunlight, poured through the frosted window and turned the cabin into something he barely recognized. The storm had broken in the night exactly as Eleanor had said it would, and outside the Wyoming plain lay buried under fresh snow that glittered so hard and bright it was difficult to look at directly. Inside the cabin, Eleanor was already up. The fire was not just surviving, it was roaring. Properly fed, crackling with purpose. The pots that had been collecting drips were emptied and stacked clean. The table had been cleared and wiped down. The smell of coffee, actual coffee, strong and dark, filled every corner of the room. Eleanor stood at the stove with her back to him, moving with the same unhurried efficiency she had brought to everything last night. "You found coffee," Caleb said, "behind the moldy flour in the back of the cupboard." I threw out the flour. She didn't look up. "And the wood was in your barn, under a tarp, not cut into proper lengths, but manageable." Now she glanced at him briefly. "Breakfast is almost ready. Eat first. Then we move the cattle." He sat up and watched her in the morning light. She had changed into her second dress, a dark blue wool more practical than the gray she'd arrived in, and pinned her hair back efficiently. The exhaustion of the night before had not entirely left her face, but underneath it, there was something alive and focused that had nothing to do with rest. He thought about the 18 miles, the 3 weeks of travel, the $12, the school that had dismissed her, the woman who had accused her, the man who had tried to take what she had not offered. He thought about all the ways the world had tried to reduce Eleanor Shaw, and he looked at her, standing in his kitchen on Christmas morning, making coffee from beans she had found in the back of his neglected cupboard, and he felt something he had not expected. Not pity, nothing close to pity, something more like recognition. They ate quickly, and without much ceremony. Eleanor did not believe in extending meals beyond their functional purpose, and went out into the bright, brutal cold to begin. The barn was worse than Caleb had allowed himself to fully register. He had been going out there once a day, doing the minimum, keeping his eyes forward and his thoughts blunt. Eleanor walked in and stopped and looked at everything, really looked without flinching, and Caleb saw his cattle through a stranger's eyes for the first time in months. Ribs showing through dull, lifeless coats, eyes half closed or crusted with discharge. The smell of sickness so deep in the hay and the walls that it had become the ambient air of the place. Most of them were lying down. Several barely lifted their heads at the sound of the door. Eleanor stood in the entrance for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she rolled up her sleeves and walked toward the nearest animal, a roan heifer who had been one of his best 2 years ago before. Whatever was killing them had started its slow work and crouched down beside her. "Hey, girl." Her voice was low and steady and completely without drama. Her hands moved along the animal's neck with a confident gentleness that was not softness, but something more precise, the touch of someone who was gathering information. "I know you don't feel well, but you're going to need to walk for me today." The heifer's ear twitched. Eleanor checked the animal's eyes, her gums, the texture of her coat. She ran her hands down the animal's legs, feeling for heat, for swelling, for the subtle information that a body carries in its surface. She did all of this quietly and without announcing her findings, and when she stood up, she looked at Caleb. "Get me a halter. This one can walk." "She hasn't stood on her own in 2 days. She will today," said with the same flat, simple certainty that had characterized everything Eleanor said. Not arrogance, just assessment. He got the halter. What followed was 3 hours of the hardest work Caleb had done in longer than he could accurately remember. And what made it strange, what made it different from every other hard thing he had done in the past 3 years, was that it had a point. Eleanor worked the cattle with a patience that was almost supernatural. She knew which animals could be coaxed to their feet and which needed to be supported. She knew when to push and when to wait, when a firm hand would do more good than a gentle one, and when gentleness was the only tool that would work. She moved down the row of stalls without wasted motion, assessing and deciding and acting, and Caleb followed her lead with a growing and confused sense that he was watching someone do exactly what they were built to do. 2 animals could not be made to stand. "We leave them for now," Eleanor said, looking at them with an expression that was not quite hardness, but a very controlled form of grief. "If we can save the others, we come back. If we can't move them by tomorrow." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "But not today. Today we save who we can save." They walked the herd to the North Spring through snow that came to Caleb's knees and places Eleanor at the front of the line with the roan heifer on a lead rope talking to her in a low and steady murmur that seemed to genuinely keep the animal moving when everything else would have given up. Caleb brought up the rear, watching the slow progress of 20 animals that should have been dead already making their way through the white winter morning toward clean water. Because a stranger who had walked 18 miles through a blizzard had looked at them and decided they were worth saving. When the heifer finally reached the spring and lowered her head to the water cold and clear, and completely untouched by whatever the mine upstream had done to the creek, she drank with the focused intensity of an animal that had been thirsty for a very long time. And when she lifted her head again, there was something in her eyes that had not been there in the barn. Not health, not yet, but the beginning of the possibility of it. Eleanor let out a breath that she had perhaps been holding since the night before. "Now," she said, "we make the tonic." Back in the cabin, she directed him like a general who had fought this particular battle before and knew exactly which mistakes to avoid. Every piece of scrap metal in the barn, Old nails, a broken horseshoe, a rusted piece of rakehead that had been sitting in the corner for 2 years, went into a pot of boiling water. She strained it, added the molasses she had found in the back of the cupboard, the same cupboard where the coffee had been hiding, the same cupboard that seemed to be yielding up its secrets to her, one by one like a confession. The mixture came out dark and syrupy and smelled of iron and sweetness in a combination that was not pleasant, but was somehow bracing, purposeful. Twice a day, she said, morning and evening. We force it down their throats if they fight it, and they will fight it, and we do it anyway. She looked at him steadily. For weeks, possibly months, with no guarantee of success. Sounds familiar, Caleb said, and surprised himself by meaning it almost as a joke. The corner of Eleanor's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. They spent the rest of the day working side by side, repairing the makeshift fence around the spring paddock, hauling food and supplies, preparing more tonic, going back for the two animals that could not walk, and pulling them on a sled through the snow with the grim determination of people who had decided that giving up was not an option they were currently offering themselves. One of the animals died on the journey. Eleanor placed her hand on the still flank for exactly 1 moment, head bowed, and then said quietly and without drama, "Unhitch her, we'll come back. We save the one we can still save." 22 cattle, 22 out of 23. Not a miracle, but not nothing. That evening, Caleb found himself standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching Eleanor sit at the table by firelight, mending a hole in one of the blankets with a needle and thread she had produced from somewhere in her trunk. The cabin was warmer than it had been in months. The smell of cooking still lingered. The fire burned with actual commitment rather than the half-hearted persistence of something that had nearly given up. "You don't have to do all this," he said. Eleanor looked up from her mending. "Yes, I do." "Why?" She set down the blanket and looked at him with those direct, clear eyes. "Because this is my home now, because I have nowhere else to go, because sitting idle while everything falls apart is not who I am." She paused. "And because you needed help, whether or not you wanted to admit it." Caleb thought about the night before, about sitting in the cold, in the dark, not going outside for the wood he knew was there waiting for nothing in particular. "I'm not easy to be around," he said. "I haven't been good company for a long time." "I'm not looking for company." She picked up the mending again. "I'm looking for a partner. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "And if I can't be that, if I'm too," he searched for the honest word again, "broke, empty, gone. If I'm too far gone for that, then you learn," Eleanor said simply. "Same as I'm learning, same as we're both doing." She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of observable fact rather than an aspiration, as though learning, adjusting, continuing forward were simply what people did, the way water found its way downhill. Not because it was easy or because the outcome was certain, but because the alternative was to stop entirely, and stopping was simply not in Eleanor Shaw's vocabulary. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he came inside and closed the door behind him. The days that followed had a structure that neither of them had designed, but both of them moved into as though it had always been there. Up before dawn, out to the spring paddock with buckets of iron tonic, the cold coming off the snow in waves that burned the face and hands. The cattle fought the treatment, some more than others, the roan heifer with a particular stubbornness that Eleanor seemed to find almost admirable, and enough of it went down their throats each time to count. Then back to the cabin, breakfast made quickly and eaten quickly because there was always more to do. Eleanor attacked the repairs with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything else. The leaking roof was first. She went up on it herself in the second week, despite Caleb's objections, patching tar into the worst gaps while he handed materials up to her and tried not to watch her too closely in case she fell. Then the walls. She found rags and stuffed them into cracks, mixed rough plaster from clay. She dug near the creek bank, worked methodically from corner to corner in the evenings until the cabin stopped breathing cold air in through 100 small wounds. Caleb cut timber. He hadn't done it in months, hadn't done much of anything in months. That wasn't the absolute minimum required to technically stay alive, and the first day his hands cramped and his shoulders burned, and he was useless by afternoon. The second day was slightly better. The third day he lasted until sundown. Eleanor didn't comment on his progress. She simply continued working alongside him, or separately, or wherever the day's needs required, and when he flagged, she picked up the slack without drawing attention to it, and when he needed her help, she gave it without being asked and without noting that she had. It was the most functional partnership he had ever experienced with someone he barely knew. By the fourth day, the roan heifer gained weight. Not much. A person who didn't know her might not have noticed. But Caleb noticed, and when Eleanor checked the animal that morning and her hands moved along the heifer's flank, and the expression on her face shifted fractionally, barely perceptibly, in the direction of something other than controlled concern, he felt something shift in his own chest in response. Something small and terrifying. Something that felt distantly like the beginning of hope. On the sixth day, two more cattle, who had been lying down when they arrived at the spring, began walking voluntarily around the paddock. On the eighth day, the sickest of the animals, the one they had dragged on the sled through the snow, the one that had trembled with every step to the water, lifted her head when Eleanor approached and made a sound that was the first voluntary communication she had offered since they'd found her. "It's working," Caleb said, and couldn't keep the wonder entirely out of his voice. Eleanor was checking the animal's gums with focused attention. "Don't celebrate yet. Long way to go." But that evening, sitting at the table with their supper, he saw it on her face, the thing she was trying not to let show. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. The careful satisfaction of a person whose gamble was beginning to pay out. He didn't say anything about it, but he saw it. And in the weeks that followed, as the cattle steadied and the cabin stopped leaking and the pantry began to fill again, from the small payments Eleanor received from neighbors who started appearing at their door drawn by word of whatever she had done for the roan heifer, Caleb Hartman began slowly and with extreme caution to want things again. Small things at first. To see the cattle fully recovered. To patch the last of the roof before the next snow. To have coffee in the morning. Sitting across from someone who drank it the same way he did, black and fast eyes already on the day ahead. Then, without quite deciding, to bigger things. To hear Eleanor's voice in the evening. To work beside her in the cold and feel the particular satisfaction of shared labor going well. To watch her move through the world with that steadiness, incompetence, and quiet refusal to be defeated, and to feel somewhere deep in the hollow places where hope had died the faintest suggestion that those places might not be permanent. He was afraid of that feeling. He had been afraid of it since the night she arrived, but he no longer quite wished it would go away. The letter was not hidden. That was the thing that stayed with Caleb afterward, the fact that it had not been concealed, not tucked beneath a false bottom, or sealed inside another envelope, but simply folded and placed in the small wooden box at the top of Eleanor's trunk, alongside a dried flower and a ribbon, and the few ordinary objects a woman carries across the country when she is carrying everything she has left in the world. He had not been looking for it. He had been looking for Eleanor's medical kit. She had been called to the Porter Ranch in an emergency, had left in a hurry, had asked him to bring her bag of instruments and the kit she kept in the trunk. He had opened the trunk carefully with the specific focused attention of a man trying very hard not to see more than he was looking for. The letter was in a woman's handwriting, a handwriting he recognized. He had looked at it for a long moment before he understood what he was seeing. Then the world tilted. Margaret's handwriting had a particular quality, a slight forward lean. The letter T always crossed too far to the right, the capital M drawn with 3 peaks instead of 2, because she had learned to write from an aunt who made her letters with unusual loops and had never entirely lost the influence. He would have known it in complete darkness. He had known it on every note she had ever left him on the shopping list pinned to the door on the letter she had sent him when he was in Cheyenne for 3 weeks, buying winter feed, the letter he had read until the paper wore soft at the folds. He knew her handwriting, and it was on this letter, in Eleanor Shaw's box. He sat down on the edge of the bed with the letter in his hands and read it slowly. Once, then again. Margaret had written it, the date in the upper corner, placed it in November of 1884, 3 months before she died. She had addressed it to the mail-order bride agency and asked them to hold it until a specific inquiry was received. An inquiry from a man in Wyoming. A man she described in terms that made Caleb's throat close, not because they were flattering, but because they were precisely and mercilessly true. A good man who has forgotten how to want things. A man who will need more patience than most women are prepared to give, and who will give back more than he knows how to say. She had been planning for this, For months before she died, she had been planning for the possibility of his survival without her, and she had done it the only way Margaret ever did anything, practically completely without sentimentality. She had written to the agency. She had described the ranch and the man honestly. She had asked them to find, when the time came, a woman who was not afraid of hard work or hard men or hard land. Eleanor had been the only woman who responded. Caleb was still sitting on the edge of the bed, the letter in his hands, when he heard the door and Eleanor came in from the Porter Ranch, her coat dusted with snow and her face carrying the particular quality of carefully managed exhaustion that meant she had done difficult work. She looked at him, then at the letter in his hands. Something crossed her face, not guilt exactly, but a bracing of the self, a preparation for something she had known was coming. "You were going to tell me," Caleb said. His voice came out, strange, flat, and measured in a way that didn't quite match the feeling underneath it. "Yes." When? When it seemed right. Eleanor unwound her scarf and hung it with steady hands. "I wasn't certain when that would be." He looked at the letter, then at her. "You came here because she asked you to." "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," Eleanor said, and her voice was even. "That part was entirely true and remains true. But yes, I responded to a letter that Margaret sent because she had described a man in a situation that seemed that I thought I could help." She paused. "I wanted to tell you, I should have told you on the first night, but you were already so, she stopped herself. "Already so what?" She looked at him directly. "Already so close to not making it. I thought if I told you before you had anything to hold on to, you would close the door in my face and I would never be able to help." The silence in the cabin was very complete. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the snow on the pasture was smooth and undisturbed, white and flawless, and somewhere beyond it, the 22 cattle he had written off as dead were eating and drinking and getting stronger every day because of the woman standing behind him. The feeling inside him was not what he had expected. He had expected anger, the clean, simple variety that was easy to hold and easier to use. What he found instead was something more complicated, less comfortable, and more honest. He had been managed, carefully, gently, with the best of intentions, but managed. She had known something about him that he did not know she knew, and she had chosen when and how to use that knowledge, and even now he could not quite bring himself to say she had been wrong to do it. Because she had not been wrong, he would have closed the door. "What does it say?" he asked. "Exactly. What did she write about me?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the box, took out the letter, unfolded it, and read it aloud. She read every word. "He will tell you the ranch is failing, and this is true. He will tell you he is not young, and this is also true. He will not tell you that he built this place with his hands over 15 years and knows every board and stone of it. He will not tell you that he was the kind of man who woke up glad to work once. He has lost that and does not believe it can come back, and so he will not say it. But it can come back. I know, because I watched it leave, and leaving and arriving are different directions of the same road. I am asking you to come because I cannot stay, and he will not survive alone, and he deserves better than the version of the future he is currently planning for himself. I am asking you to come not as a replacement for what we had. Nothing replaces that, and you should not try, but as something new. A partnership built from what is actually present, not from what was. He is stubborn and silent and will make you work for everything. He will also, when he has decided to trust you, be the most steady and reliable person you have ever known. That is, if you can be patient enough to wait for the decision. I believe you can. The kind of woman who answers a letter like this is the kind of woman who can take care of him. He would hate me for asking, but I'm asking anyway." The cabin was very still when Eleanor finished reading. Caleb stood at the window with his back to her for a long time. Long enough that the light shifted the afternoon sun moving across the snow outside in its slow winter arc. "She knew she was dying," he finally said. "Yes. She wrote this 3 months before. The date on the letter says so." He was quiet again. Then unexpectedly his voice broke, not completely, but a fracture running through it, a place where the thing he had been holding together for 3 years suddenly showed itself. "She never told me she was worried about what would happen after." "She was worried enough to plan for it," Eleanor said gently. "That's its own kind of conversation." He turned from the window. His face had changed something in the armor of it, the particular cast of controlled emptiness that he wore so constantly he had forgotten it was a choice had cracked open along old lines to reveal the man underneath. Caleb Hartman, who had been a good husband and a hard-working rancher and a decent neighbor before grief had made him into a ghost. "I don't know how to feel about this," he said. "I don't know how you should," Eleanor replied. "I only know I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. "Did she—" He stopped, started again. "What she wrote about what I was like before, is that why you stayed? Because she made me sound—" "I stayed because the cattle were dying and you were clearly going to let them," Eleanor said, with a return of her usual directness. "And because when I looked at this place, I saw something worth saving. That had nothing to do with Margaret's letter and everything to do with what was actually in front of me." She paused. "But knowing what she saw in you, yes. It helped me understand what I was working with." He sat down heavily at the table. The letter was still in his hand. "Take it," Eleanor said. "It was meant for you eventually. I've been carrying it long enough." That night, Caleb went to the rise behind the house where the pine tree stood. He stood in the dark at the edge of Margaret's grave and looked at the headstone he had placed there with hands that were still shaking 3 years ago and had barely visited since. He heard footsteps in the snow behind him. Eleanor came and sat down cross-legged in the snow beside the headstone, without being invited, without asking permission, and without saying anything. They stayed there together for a long time. The cold deepened around them, and neither of them moved. Above the plain, the stars came out in the enormous, profligate way they had out here, far from any city where there was nothing to dim them. Eventually, Caleb said, "She was funnier than I ever gave her credit for in public. She kept it for private. She thought it was undignified to be funny where strangers could see." "That sounds lonely," Eleanor said. "She didn't mind. She had me." He was quiet. "I was the only one who got to see that part of her. That's something rare." "Yes." More silence, an owl somewhere in the pines. The vast and indifferent cold. "The letter," Caleb said. "She got one thing wrong." Eleanor looked at him. "She wrote that you shouldn't try to replace what we had." Yes, that's right. But she wrote it like the concern was that you might try and that I'd need to be protected from that." He looked at the headstone and then at Eleanor, this woman who moved through his world with such steady certainty and such entirely unperformed competence. "That's not the thing I've been afraid of." "What have you been afraid of?" "That I'd want something new," he said. "That I'd want it and lose it. That losing things is the only thing I'm good at anymore." Eleanor was quiet for a while. "I know about that kind of afraid," she finally said. They stayed until it was too cold to stay any longer, and then they walked back to the cabin together and went to bed and didn't speak of it again. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence between them. It had become, without either of them deciding this, a silence that was carrying more than emptiness. The man arrived on a Tuesday in early February when the snow had packed down to a hard crust that crunched under boots and wagon wheels and gave the plain a quality of reluctant permanence. He came from the direction of Casper in a good wagon with a good horse, which meant money, and he wore a coat that was slightly too fine for the Wyoming winter, which meant he was from somewhere else. He tied up outside the cabin and knocked in the way of a man who expects doors to open for him. Richard Holt introduced himself as a representative of the First Territorial Bank of Casper. He was perhaps 50, with a face designed to convey authority without warmth, the kind of face that had spent decades in a position to make decisions about other people's lives and had made them without losing sleep. He carried a leather case and wore a hat that had cost more than Caleb's best saddle. "You're in default on your loan, Mr. Hartman," Holt said, sitting at the table with the studied ease of a man settling into his own office rather than someone else's kitchen. He had declined the coffee Eleanor offered, which Caleb noted and filed away. "March 15th is the deadline as stated in your original agreement. However, he opened the case. The bank has an alternative to offer." Caleb sat across from him and said nothing. Eleanor stood at the stove with her back to them, and he noticed she had gone very still. The offer was simple. The bank would forgive the debt entirely in exchange for the land. Not a sale at fair market value, a deed transfer fully signed in exchange for a clear ledger and 30 days to vacate. The land's been appraised, Holt said, placing the papers on the table. You'll see the bank's assessment there. Caleb looked at the number on the paper. It was less than a quarter of what the land was worth. That appraisal is incorrect, he said. Holt smiled the smile of a man who has expected this response and prepared for it. Land values in this county have declined significantly. Mr. Hartman, particularly for properties with, he paused, choosing the word, challenged productive capacity. The bank's assessment reflects current market conditions. The cattle are recovering, Caleb said. The herd is stronger than it's been in a year. So I've heard. Holt's eyes moved briefly and deliberately to Eleanor. You've had some outside assistance. Eleanor turned from the stove then. She looked at Holt with the same steady, clear gaze she brought to everything, and Caleb saw something happen in Holt's expression, a very small recalibration, as though he had been expecting a different kind of woman. Mr. Holt, Eleanor said, what is the mining operation upstream planning to do with the land to the south of their current site? A pause, brief, but Caleb caught it. I'm not aware of any mining interests in this area, Holt said. The Copperfield Mining Company operating approximately 5 miles upstream on the Hartman Creek tributary. Eleanor's voice was completely even. They've been in operation since last spring. The copper runoff from their extraction process has been contaminating the downstream water supply. We have treated the Hartman cattle for copper poisoning and they are recovering. I have documentation of the diagnosis and treatment. She held his gaze. I'm curious about the timing of the bank's interest in this particular property. Something shifted in Holt's face. Not much. Enough. Mrs. Hartman, he said in a tone designed to gently redirect a woman who had wandered into a conversation that didn't concern her. These are matters of banking, and my wife has a relevant question, Caleb said. He said it quietly without heat, but with a finality that apparently clarified something for Holt. I'd appreciate an answer. Holt closed his leather case. The bank's offer stands until the 15th. I'd encourage you to consider it carefully. He stood. Good day. After the wagon had disappeared down the road, Eleanor stood at the window and watched it go, and Caleb watched Eleanor. What do you know? He asked. A man came in last week, she said slowly. A worker. He'd been injured at the mine, a rope had frayed and dropped a load of ore on his foot. He needed the bones set. While I was working on him, he talked. People talk when they're in pain. They say things they wouldn't otherwise say. She turned from the window. The mine is expanding south. They need the water rights and the land access that runs through this valley. There are at least 3 ranchers in this area, though, whose properties sit directly in the path of where they want to go. She paused. One of them is already gone. He sold to the bank last autumn for almost nothing. The Hendersons told me. Caleb stared at her. They're poisoning the water deliberately. I don't know that for certain. It may have started as negligence, but the mine has been operating long enough that they know what the runoff is doing, and they haven't stopped it. She met his eyes. And someone who benefits from ranchers failing and selling cheap has an arrangement with the bank. The silence in the cabin after she finished speaking had a different quality than any silence that had been in it before. We don't have proof, Caleb said. No, not yet. If they decide to, he stopped. If Holt decides to make things difficult for us before the 15th, I know. Eleanor's jaw set in a way he was learning to recognize the expression she wore when she had assessed a threat and was deciding how to respond to it. There's something else. Holt, the way he looked at me when I mentioned the mining company. I've seen that look before. From who? She was quiet for a moment. Then, a man in Philadelphia named Caldwell. Richard Caldwell. He was the superintendent who had me dismissed from the school. He had the same... She stopped, chose the words carefully. The same quality of looking at a woman who is saying accurate, inconvenient things and deciding the most efficient way to remove the inconvenience. Caleb waited. I don't know if there's a connection, Eleanor said. I may be finding patterns where there aren't any, but I want you to know if Holt goes looking for reasons to discredit me, he may not have to look very far. The story he would find would be, she paused, not flattering, depending on whose version he found. I know your version, Caleb said. Something moved across Eleanor's face. Yes, she said quietly, you do. The days between that visit and the deadline moved with the particular quality of time under pressure. each one clearly distinct, fully present, and simultaneously too short and too long. Eleanor's healing work continued and expanded because word had reached farther than either of them had anticipated. A woman arrived from 20 miles east with a child who had been coughing for 3 weeks. A rancher from north of the Henderson spread showed up with a gash on his arm that had been poorly dressed and was beginning to show signs of infection. Eleanor treated them all with the same calm efficiency, the same careful honesty about what she could and could not offer, and the same quiet authority that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with genuine knowledge and genuine care. The gifts accumulated on the kitchen shelf. A smoked ham, a tin of honey, a bolt of fabric, a sack of dried corn. Coins when people had them, trade when they didn't. It was not wealth, but it was accumulating. On the 1st of March, Caleb counted what they had. He counted it 3 times to be certain. They were $47 short of the bank payment. He told Eleanor that evening. She did not react the way he had half expected, no visible distress, no uncertainty. She sat with it for a moment, the way she sat with most problems, letting it become real before she responded to it. Then she went to her trunk. The wooden box came out. Not the letter this time. A smaller compartment when he hadn't noticed. Inside it, wrapped in a square of dark cloth, a silver locket, a pair of earrings with small garnets, a bracelet with a single blue stone that caught the firelight and held it. "These were my mother's," Eleanor said. She held the locket up and it turned slowly on its chain. "All I have of her." "Eleanor, I've thought about it," she said simply, finally, not asking for his response. She was a practical woman. She would have wanted me to use what I had to save what mattered. This matters. She looked at the locket for a moment longer. Then she placed the pieces carefully back in the cloth. "We take them to town tomorrow." Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. "You'll get them back," he said finally. "When we have the money, I will buy them back." "Maybe." She tied the cloth closed with the same careful hands she used for everything. "Or maybe what we build here will matter more than what we had to give to build it. Either way, this is what needs doing." He had known abstractly that Eleanor Shaw was strong. He had watched her be strong for weeks in every visible and practical way. But sitting there watching her hold her dead mother's jewelry and set it aside with steady hands for the sake of a ranch that wasn't even legally hers, yet this was something else. This was a different order of strength entirely. They rode to town the next morning. The assayer gave them less than the pieces were worth, which was the nature of necessity and desperation, and the disadvantage of needing to sell immediately. It was enough. When they walked out of the bank on the 14th of March, the payment made the debt cleared for another year the land secured. Eleanor stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk and looked at the paper in her hands. "Yours," Caleb said. She looked at him. "The land, the ranch, whatever comes next." He was looking at her steadily with the directness he had slowly relearned over the past months in her presence. "Ours." Eleanor folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket. "Then we should make it worth keeping," she said. But walking back to the wagon, he saw the small private smile she was trying to control. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Caleb Hartman smiled back. The spring afternoon when Caleb found Eleanor in the kitchen doorway at dusk, hands pressed flat against the doorframe, staring at the horizon with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not calculation, not planning. Something further back than that. Something raw and unprotected that disappeared the moment she heard his footsteps. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, quickly. He waited. She let out a breath. Then without turning, "Do you know what today is? April something? 14th? The 15th. She was quiet. 2 years ago today, a man in Philadelphia told me in front of 11 members of the school board that I was a person of compromised character and that my presence in the school was a liability to the institution. He had manufactured the reasons. He had paid 2 people to corroborate a story that wasn't true, and every person in that room believed him because it was easier to believe him than to believe me." She paused. I don't think about it most days, but some days it's very close to the surface." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I know what that man did," he said. "You told me." "Yes. And I know what the other one did, and the one after that." She nodded, still not turning. "So you know that I know," he said, "exactly who you are. Not the version Caldwell told, or anyone else. The version that walked 18 miles through a blizzard and saved 22 cattle and set a child's leg with nothing but knowledge and nerve. He paused. That version is the only one that exists as far as I'm concerned. She turned then. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. Eleanor Shaw had a way of stopping just short of tears that suggested she had taught herself not to arrive there and that the teaching had cost something. I know, she said. You've never made me feel otherwise. Then let it go, he said, not harshly. The way you might say it about weather that has been overstaying its welcome. It was 2 years ago and 1,500 miles away, and the man who did it is still there being small and stupid in his small and stupid way, and you are here. A silence. Here, Eleanor repeated, as though she were locating herself. Haven Ridge, Caleb said. He hadn't been planning to say it, hadn't known until the words came out that he'd been thinking about a name for the ranch. That's what I want to call it, what this place has become. He looked out at the spring land green beginning to push through the mud and dead grass, the cattle visible in the north paddock, the repaired cabin behind them. A haven on a ridge. Eleanor looked at him, then at the land. Haven Ridge, she said slowly, tasting the words, honest and hopeful at the same time. That seemed right. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was only beginning to learn how to read, the expression she wore when she was genuinely moved and genuinely trying not to show how much. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. April to December 1888. The community came to Eleanor before she had fully decided to let the community in. That was how it worked. She learned healing was not a service you offered in a place like this. It was something that found you, that arrived at your door with desperate need and no alternative. And the only real choice was whether you answered or didn't. Eleanor had long since settled that question. Samuel Porter's daughter came first, the little girl with the cough that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned in passing. Eleanor made tea from the herbs she had been growing in pots on the windowsill, explained the dosage, and offered the caveat she always offered. If she's not better in a week, she needs a real doctor. This helps with symptoms. It's not a cure. The little girl improved in 4 days. After that, the stream didn't stop. A man with a deep knife wound from a fencing accident. A woman with an infected tooth. Eleanor could not extract it, but could reduce the inflammation enough to get her to the dentist in Casper. An elderly rancher with joint pain so severe he had stopped being able to work. Eleanor couldn't cure what ailed him, but made a liniment that gave him back enough function to feel human. Each person brought something. A chicken, a jar of preserves, coins, occasionally just thanks, which Eleanor accepted with the same equanimity she brought to everything, and which were she knew not nothing. Thanks were the early layer of trust, and trust out here was the hardest currency. Caleb watched her work. He tried not to watch too obviously, but he was increasingly aware that he was not succeeding at this. There was something that happened to Eleanor when she was treating someone, the particular focused stillness, the hands that moved with such practiced confidence, the voice that dropped to a frequency that seemed designed specifically to reduce fear, that he found he could not look away from for long. He was also aware in the way that a person becomes aware of a slow change that they've been not noticing for weeks, that Eleanor was no longer simply the stranger who had arrived in a blizzard. She was the most familiar presence in his world. The sound of her moving through the cabin in the morning, already building the fire, that already thinking about what the day needed, that sound had become without his permission necessary. The way she ate dinner with one hand on her book and the fork moving to her mouth by muscle memory. The way she said his name, Caleb, with a particular weight on the first syllable that no one else had ever used. He was falling in love with his wife. This seemed, to the part of him that had arranged itself very carefully around the idea of never risking that again, alarming and unavoidable in equal measure. He said nothing about it. He worked beside her. He learned the rhythm of her days and accommodated it. He fixed things around the house, of the door that stuck in wet weather, the window latch that had needed replacing, for a year the shelf in the kitchen that listed to the left because a screw had worked loose without being asked, and watched from the corner of his eye to see if she noticed, which she always did, and said nothing about, which was its own kind of language between them. It was early May when Richard Holt came back. He arrived on a Wednesday, which was a day Eleanor was at the Henderson Ranch tending to a child with scarlet fever and was not expected home until evening. Caleb noticed this and thought it was likely not accidental. Holt had a man with him this time, a younger man, thin and sharp-featured, carrying a leather satchel, with the air of someone whose purpose was to produce documents and witness signatures. "I have a new proposal," Holt said, settling into the chair across from Caleb, with the ease that still grated that quality of occupying space as though he had purchased the rights to it. "The loan is current," Caleb said. "Yes, the bank notes that." Holt opened the satchel himself. "However, a new opportunity has arisen in the county. A land acquisition consortium has expressed interest in several properties along the Hartman Creek Valley. The offer is substantially improved from what we discussed in February." The papers went on the table. The number was better. Caleb looked at it and could not entirely pretend it wasn't better. But it was still less than fair, and it still required leaving the land that Margaret was buried on, and it still had the particular smell of a thing that was being done to him rather than offered to him. "Where is this consortium intending to develop?" Caleb asked. "Various agricultural and industrial purposes. Connected to the Copperfield mining operation." Holt's face remained completely still. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the consortium's affiliations." "I'll take that as a yes." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "My wife has been treating patients from that mine since January. Workers who talk. A man last month told her about the Eastern expansion plans, the maps they're drawing up, the water rights they need." He held Holt's gaze. "We know what this land is worth to them." A very brief silence. "Your wife," Holt said in a tone that Caleb had been waiting for since February, "is an interesting figure in this community. Quite a reputation for someone with no formal credentials, no medical training, no certification of any kind." He paused in the way of a man allowing an implication to settle. "I've done some inquiring about her history in Pennsylvania, the situation with the school, the accusation of theft. There are people who remember her in Philadelphia who have concerns about her character." Caleb looked at him. He felt with extraordinary clarity the specific kind of anger that is not hot but cold, the kind that doesn't make you want to shout but makes you very still and very focused and very certain about what needs to happen next. "Get out of my house," Caleb said. Holt began to speak. "I said get out." Caleb stood, not threatening, simply standing in the way of a man who has made a final decision and is waiting for the other party to recognize it. "Take your papers and your hired witness and your secondhand slanders and get off my land. If you come back without a legal warrant, I'll treat you as a trespasser." "That's not a threat. It's a description of what will happen." Holt studied him for a moment with the calculating look of a man deciding whether a situation is retrievable. Then he picked up his papers, nodded to his companion, and left. Caleb stood in the cabin after the wagon had gone and breathed carefully for a long moment. Then he went outside and began splitting wood. He split wood for 2 hours with the focused intensity of a man transferring something that has nowhere else to go, and by the time Eleanor returned from the Henderson ranch in the late afternoon, there was enough wood stacked against the cabin wall to last 3 weeks. "Someone was here," she said, looking at the wood. "Holt." Her face changed. "He mentioned Philadelphia." "He did." And Caleb set the axe down and looked at her. "I told him to leave." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's going to try to use it. My history. Whatever version of it his contacts in Pennsylvania gave him." "I know. If he goes to the community, to the people I've been treating, the families who have trusted me, it could." "I know," Caleb said again, "which is why you should tell them first." She looked at him. "Before he gets there," Caleb said. "Before whatever version he's carrying arrives in this county and starts working on people who trust you. You tell them the truth, your version, the full version." He held her gaze. "They know you, Eleanor. They know what you've done here, who you've been here. Let them weigh what they see against what some banker from Casper tells them." She was very still for a moment. This was, Caleb knew, the thing Eleanor Shaw had spent years not doing, not because she was a coward, not even close, but because she had been burned badly enough that standing up and being seen in a room full of people who might choose to disbelieve her felt like a particular category of impossible. He watched her work through it, the specific quality of her stillness when she was deciding something. "When," she said, "there's a community meeting at the Henderson barn on Friday, Henderson's been organizing it, something about the water rights, actually. Half the county will be there. He paused. Good time. Eleanor nodded once, slowly. All right, she said. Friday arrived cold and clear. April lights sharp and honest, and the Henderson barn was crowded in the way that only happened when something serious was in the air. Caleb counted 30 people before he stopped counting ranchers and their families, some he knew well and some only by sight, all with the look of people who had come because something was happening and they needed to understand it. James Henderson opened the meeting with the water rights issue which had been coming for months. The mining operations' effects on the creek were now impossible to ignore, and 3 ranchers besides Caleb had lost cattle. The conversation was practical and angry, in the measured way of people who know how to work problems, and for 45 minutes it stayed on the question of who could do what and how. Then Holt's man appeared. Not Holt himself, the thin, sharp-featured assistant sitting near the back with his leather satchel who had been quiet until Porter finished speaking about his recovered mare. Before we proceed, the assistant said, in the voice of someone who has been told exactly what to say, I think the community ought to be aware of some relevant history regarding the... Eleanor stood up. The room went quiet immediately, the particular quiet of people who have come to know that when Eleanor Hartman stands up, something significant is about to be said. His name is Dawes, Eleanor said. He's a legal assistant employed by the First Territorial Bank of Casper, which has a financial interest in acquiring land in this valley at below-market prices. He's been sent here to discredit me before I can testify to what I know about the mine's practices and their relationship to the bank. She turned to look at Dawes directly. Am I wrong about any of that? Dawes's mouth opened, then closed. The information he has about me is accurate in its facts. Eleanor continued, turning back to the room. She spoke steadily, without performance, in the same voice she used to explain a diagnosis, clear and direct, and entirely without pretense. I was dismissed from a teaching position in Philadelphia in 1883 by a superintendent who wanted something from me that I refused to give. I was accused of theft by an employer whose son I fought off when he assaulted me in a storeroom. These things happened. I can't change them. She paused. What I can tell you is that the version of those events that a bank's hired lawyer is going to describe to you will have a great deal in common with the version told by the men who caused them, because that version is the one that was written down and the one that was believed at the time. The room was absolutely silent. I've been in this valley for 4 months, Eleanor said. I've treated the Porter mare and I've treated the Morrison boy, and I've sat up all night with the Henderson girl when no one else was available, and I've done it because it was needed and because I could. You've watched me work. You know what I know and what I don't know, and I've never promised anything I couldn't deliver. She looked around the room at Mrs. Henderson, at Porter, at the dozen families whose kitchens she had sat in and whose sick she had helped. I'm asking you to weigh what you've seen against what a bank lawyer is about to tell you. That's all. You can make whatever decision you make. She sat down. The silence held for a moment longer. Then Samuel Porter, who had been the first neighbor to come to her door and the first to be skeptical, and the one who had brought dried apples and butter as an apology, said, My daughter is standing in this room right now. She had a cough that her mother and I were scared about for 3 weeks. Eleanor made her a tea and told us what to watch for, and by the end of the week, the girl was fine. He looked at Dawes with a flat and unfriendly expression. You've got something to say about the woman who did that. I suggest you say it to my face. No one said anything to Porter's face. Dawes gathered his satchel and left. The community meeting continued for another hour, focused entirely on the water rights issue and what could be done about it, and by the end of it, 3 ranchers had agreed to sign affidavits about the effects of the mine's runoff on their livestock and water supply. Eleanor's medical documentation, careful, detailed, written in the precise hand of a woman who had learned from a man who believed records mattered, was formally included as evidence. It was not the end of the fight. These things were never quick, and Richard Holt had resources that they did not. But something had changed in the room that evening, and Caleb felt it clearly. The community had been asked to choose, and it had chosen, and now Haven Ridge was not just a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere, but a place with people behind it. Walking home in the cold evening air, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. You were right, she said finally, about telling them first. You were the one who stood up. After you told me I could. He thought about that. Is that how that worked? She looked at him sideways with the expression that was not quite a smile but contained one. That's how that worked. He reached over and took her hand where it hung at her side. She did not pull away. They walked the rest of the way home like that, in the dark, in the particular silence of two people who have just passed through something together and are still inside the feeling of it. 3 weeks later, a man arrived from Cheyenne on a good horse with a letter of introduction from the county medical board. His name was Dr. Aaron Webb. He was 50 with a precise gray beard and the alert assessing eyes of a man who had spent his career looking at people and determining what they needed. He arrived at Haven Ridge in the early afternoon on a Tuesday, read the letter he had brought aloud at the kitchen table, while Eleanor poured coffee and then looked at her over the rim of his cup. I've heard about your work, he said, from Henderson, from the Morrisons, from half a dozen people between here and Casper who seem to think you're either a miracle or a hazard, depending on who you ask. And which do you think? Eleanor asked. Neither. He set down the cup. I think you're a skilled practitioner with substantial practical training and no certification. That's a problem in some context. He paused. It's less of a problem in a context where the nearest certified physician is 2 days' ride in good weather and the population is growing faster than credentialed medical care can reach. He looked at her directly. The county is establishing a formal network of medical practitioners, midwives, herbalists, wound care specialists, people who are already doing the work and can be brought under an official framework that gives them legal standing and basic compensation. He paused. I'm asking if you'd be willing to be part of that. Eleanor was very still. Official standing, she said slowly. A formal designation, not a physician's license that requires medical school, but a recognized county practitioner. Your records would be official. Your treatments would be covered under the county's compensation framework. And if anyone, he paused with the delicacy of a man who knows there is a specific history involved. If anyone chose to challenge your legitimacy in the future, you would have a documented record and institutional backing. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He was watching her from across the table with an expression she could not entirely read, but what she could read in it was the particular steadiness he had developed over months of working beside her, certainty that she would make the right decision, and complete willingness to support it, whatever it was. She turned back to Dr. Webb. Yes, she said, simply, finally. The mine investigation stretched into summer. The affidavits were filed. A territorial inspector came in June and spent 3 days examining the water supply. The findings when they arrived in August were conclusive enough to require the mining operation to install containment measures for their runoff. Not a shutdown, not the full reckoning that felt warranted, but a genuine change that began the slow process of the creek returning to what it had been. Richard Holt was reassigned to a different territory. Whether this was consequence or coincidence was not entirely clear, and Caleb decided he did not care. The land was still theirs. The cattle were healthy. The debt was current. In September, Eleanor came to him in the barn where he was finishing the last repairs on the south fence and said his name in a particular way that made him put down his tools. I'm with child, she said. He stood there for a moment with the words reorganizing the world around him. They had talked about this carefully and honestly in the way they talked about most things now, with the particular honesty that had become the foundation of everything between them. He had told her about the years of hoping for children with Margaret, the hope that had never resolved the grief that had accumulated around that unfulfillment, alongside the grief for Margaret herself. Eleanor had told him about her uncertainty, her fear of the way she approached the possibility, with the cautious pragmatism of a woman who had learned not to count on things before they were certain. They had agreed to be open to it, to see what came. And now Eleanor was standing in the barn doorway in the September light, one hand on the doorframe and telling him with a directness that was entirely characteristic and entirely her own. Are you, he started. Happy, she said. Verified, yes and yes. She met his eyes. You? He crossed the barn to her in 4 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead with a gentleness he hadn't known he still had access to. Both, he said. Exactly both. The pregnancy moved through autumn with its own logic. Eleanor continued working less than before with more rest built in, but with the same fundamental commitment to the community she had become part of. Mrs. Henderson and the other women of the valley took a proprietary interest in her welfare that Eleanor accepted with slightly pained grace, allowing herself to be fussed over in small doses and setting clear limits on larger ones. Haven Ridge had its name now on a carved sign above the gate that Caleb had made in evenings by firelight. The clinic that Eleanor had been asking about for months was under construction, a small building separate from the house, with proper space for examining patients and storing medical supplies. It would be finished by spring. On a Tuesday in late October, a letter arrived from Cheyenne. Eleanor read it twice, standing at the kitchen table, and then set it down. Doctor, Webb has recommended that the county formally name Haven Ridge as a medical outpost, she said. They want to put it on the official map. People in the region who need care will be directed here first. Caleb looked at her. What do you think? I think it's what this place already is, she said. It's just the paperwork catching up. He looked at the letter, then at the cabin around them, the repaired walls, the shelves of herbs and medical supplies, the wooden sign above the door that Eleanor had hand-lettered with the names of the families who had gifted them things in the first terrible winter, a quiet private record of the kindness that had made survival possible. He thought about the man who had sat in this cabin a year ago, watching the fire go out and choosing not to get more wood. The man who had stopped collecting the mail. He thought about the letter that had arrived anyway, carried in Eleanor's trunk across 3 weeks of winter travel and 18 miles on foot, written by a woman who had died and still managed to change everything. Margaret would have liked this, he said. Eleanor looked up at him. She'd have been insufferably pleased with herself, she said, and there was such warm and genuine amusement in her voice, such clear and unguarded feeling, that Caleb felt it in his chest like a cord pulled tight. She would have, he agreed, felt. The storm came in November, without the warning of the year before. It arrived fast and low from the northwest, and by the time they understood its full force, the roads were already impassable, and the county had effectively ceased to exist as anything beyond individual islands of warmth in the white. Eleanor went into labor on the second night of the storm. She told him in the same way she told him most important things, simply, directly, without drama. The contractions have started. We have time, but not a great deal. She moved through the cabin with focused efficiency, telling him what to prepare, where things were, what to watch for. Even in the middle of this, even here, she was teaching him, because Eleanor had never quite stopped teaching anyone who was paying attention. I need you to be calm, she said at one point between contractions. She had her hands on his face and was looking at him directly and steadily. I know what I'm doing. I need you to know what I'm doing. Can you do that? Tell me what to do, he said. She did. The hours that followed were the longest of Caleb Hartman's life. He had built fences in hailstorms and pulled livestock from frozen creek beds and sat with dying men in the aftermath of things he didn't like to remember. He had thought he understood what it meant to work in extremity, to keep your hands steady when everything in you was screaming to be somewhere else entirely. He had not known. He did everything Eleanor told him. He boiled water. He gathered the clean cloths she had prepared weeks ago, already prepared, because Eleanor prepared for things. He held her hand when she asked and moved away when she needed space and spoke only when speech was required and was otherwise simply present, steady and present in the way she had been present for him a year ago in this same room when he had been the one who needed holding together. As dawn broke and the storm began to ease, their daughter arrived. Caleb caught her in hands that were shaking. This small person, astonishingly, impossibly small, who announced herself to the world with a displeasure so complete and immediate that it made Eleanor laugh, despite everything a real laugh, exhausted and delighted. He cleared the airways the way Eleanor had told him. He wrapped the child in the cloth that had been warming near the fire. He placed her on Eleanor's chest. Eleanor's arms closed around her daughter with a certainty so immediate and so complete that it looked like something she had always known how to do. Hello, Eleanor said softly. Just that. Not a greeting so much as a statement, a recognition. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and breathed carefully for a long moment, feeling the previous hours leave his body slowly like water draining. You did well, Eleanor said. He looked up at her. She was pale and exhausted and radiant in the specific way of a person who has done the hardest possible thing and come through it, and she was looking at him with an expression that he had learned to read over the past year, the expression that meant Eleanor Shaw was moved and was not pretending otherwise. "You did all the work," he said. "You did everything I asked." She looked down at the child. "That's not nothing, Caleb. That's everything, actually." They named her Margaret Rose. Margaret for the woman who had started all of this, who had planned from the end of her own story for the beginning of a different one. Rose for Eleanor's mother, whose jewelry had paid for a year of safety on land that was now clearly and permanently home, a bridge between two pasts and one future. The first snow of the following December came gently, as if it had learned something from the year before. Soft flakes drifting down in the windless cold, covering Haven Ridge, in the kind of white that looked patient rather than threatening. Caleb stood on the porch in the early evening and watched it fall, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and thought about the man who had stood in this same spot a year ago, watching a different snow and feeling nothing at all. Behind him through the cabin wall, he could hear Eleanor singing. She sang to Margaret Rose in the evening's low matter-of-fact songs, not particularly melodic, because Eleanor was many things but not a singer, but delivered with the complete, unself-conscious commitment of a woman who had decided that her daughter deserved music and was going to provide it regardless of her technical limitations. The baby, for her part, appeared to find it entirely satisfactory. The door opened and Eleanor emerged, the baby on her hip, a shawl around her shoulders. She stood beside him and looked out at the snow. She wanted to see it, Eleanor said, as though the 4-month-old had expressed a preference. Caleb reached out and took his daughter from her, held the small, warm weight up toward the falling flakes. Margaret Rose tracked the movement with the intense, focused attention of someone encountering something genuinely new. And when a flake landed on her palm and she looked at it, this cold white thing that had not existed a moment ago and would not exist a moment hence, her face went through a sequence of expressions so rapid and complete that Caleb found himself laughing. "Pretty, isn't it?" he murmured. The baby made a sound that was not yet a word, but was clearly an opinion. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, and they stood there together in the cold while the snow came down, and the light from the cabin window made a gold square on the porch boards, and somewhere to the east, visible as a faint glow, even in the dark, was the Henderson place, and beyond it the Porter spread, and beyond that a dozen other farms and ranches that had, over the course of this strange year, become a community in a way that hadn't quite existed before. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of a single turning point or a hero's act, but because Eleanor had been willing to help and people had been willing to accept help, and those two willingness had built something together, the way two creeks run together and make a river quietly, inevitably, without anyone deciding it should happen. "A year ago tonight," Eleanor said. "Almost to the hour," Caleb said. "You were on my porch. You were not pleased to see me." "No." And now, he looked at her in the low light. This woman who had walked through a storm and refused to leave and rebuilt a dying thing and stood up in front of a room full of strangers and told the truth about herself and delivered her own baby in a Wyoming blizzard and had never, not once in 12 months of hard work and harder weather, suggested that any of it was too much. Now, he said, "I can't remember what the quiet was like." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then, with the small and private smile she reserved for things that genuinely moved her, "Good." Down the road, a sound, sleigh bells and lanterns bobbing through the dark, and voices. Multiple wagons, the Hendersons and the Porters and 3 other families who had decided without coordination that Christmas Eve at Haven Ridge was where they were supposed to be. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried over the cold. "We couldn't let the holiday pass without you." Eleanor turned to look at the approaching lights, then up at Caleb. There was something in her face that he recognized as the expression she wore when she was surprised, genuinely fully surprised by something good, which happened rarely enough that he had learned to notice it. "Did you arrange this?" she asked. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm not surprised." The wagons came in and the cabin filled up, and the evening became something warm and loud and entire, the way evenings are when people have decided they are celebrating something real. Mrs. Morrison's twins, now walking and opinionated, investigated everything within reach. Porter and Caleb stood near the fire and talked about the spring plans in the comfortable way of men who have become friends without quite deciding to. Eleanor moved through the room with Margaret Rose on her hip, accepting the compliments on the baby with the same practical equanimity she brought to everything, and Caleb watched her from across the room and felt the fullness of it, the specific weight of a life that was real and present and worth the living. Later, after everyone had gone and the cabin was clean and quiet, and Margaret Rose was asleep in her cradle, Eleanor and Caleb stood at the window together and watched the snow. "Do you think she'll remember any of this?" Eleanor asked, looking at their daughter. "These early years?" "Maybe not the specifics," Caleb said, "but she'll know she was loved. She'll grow up knowing that work matters and people matter in this place." He looked around the cabin at the repaired walls and the shelf of medical supplies and the carved sign above the door. "This place is where people come when they need help. That's what we wanted it to be. That's what it is." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want her to have siblings." "How many are you proposing?" "At least two more." She looked at him with the expression that contained a smile. "This house could hold more love. This house," Caleb said, "barely survived the repairs we've made to it. We'll build a bigger one." "Of course we will." She turned in his arms then and looked up at him, and in the firelight her face was so entirely what it was, no performance, no armor. Just Eleanor, serious and warm and undefeated, that Caleb could not have said in that moment what he had thought he was waiting for 3 years before. What the quiet had been for. What purpose the emptiness had served. It had held the shape of this, he thought. It had simply been waiting. "Merry Christmas, Eleanor." She reached up and put her hand against his face. A gesture so characteristic, so specifically her the hand of a healer, checking something, making sure, and yet so wholly tender that he felt it to the center of himself. "Merry Christmas, Caleb." Outside, the snow continued to fall over Haven Ridge, soft and steady, covering everything in white, making the world simple and clean. Inside, the fire burned, and two people who had been broken in separate ways and had found each other in a storm and had built something from nothing but stubbornness and mutual respect and the slow accretion of days worked alongside each other. Those two people stood at the window of the home they had saved, holding the child they had made, and were without qualification or caveat happy. That was the miracle of not destiny, not fate, just two people who had chosen every single day in small ways and large to keep choosing each other. And a ranch on a Wyoming ridge where the water ran clean and the cattle were fat, and the sign above the gate read Haven Ridge, and the lamp in the window never went out.